Or good morning, I should say, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to have been invited to this panel here with the 25th Annual Thinking Gender Conference, to be sitting amongst all these other wonderful scholars and have the opportunity to share with you all what I've been working on over the last several months. So again, I am Julie Matos. I'm a first-year graduate student at California State University, Los Angeles, in the field of communication studies. The focus of my research, as you can probably discern and was introduced, is to focus in on women's rights in public address. But before I go into detail about my study, I'd like to share with you a little bit about why I do what I do and why I'm inspired to look at women's rights in public address. So first of all, a recent article at the earlier part of this year was released by Linda Poon with NPR News. In this article, it highlights numerous sexist laws that are still in existence around the globe. For example, in Yemen, where a husband has the right to be obeyed by his wife in the interest of the family, she must permit him to have legitimate intercourse with her when she is fit to do so. In Nigeria, where it is legal to hit your wife for the purpose of correcting her. And in Russia, where women are forbidden from doing more than 450 types of jobs. And this was just a few of the many laws that exist around the globe that place women in as second-class citizens in their respective countries. Furthermore, let's take a look at what has been in the news lately in the last couple of years. So many of you might be familiar in 2012 with the gang rape in New Delhi of Jyoti Singh Pandey. Also in 2012, Malala, who was shot 3 times by the Taliban. In 2014, 276 women and girls were kidnapped by the Boko Haram. In 2014, you've probably been noticing in the news a woman named Emma Solkowitz, who is on Columbia University. She's been carrying her mattress around the campus until her assailant is either expelled or leaves the campus. And here, just locally in Los Angeles in 2015, 10 teens were arrested in the sexual assault of 2 teenage girls. This assault had been going on since approximately 2013. So it's a rather depressing list, and I don't want to give you the impression that women's rights hasn't improved in the last several decades, but I think that this list shows us that there is much work still to be done 15 years into the millennium. So all of that being said, these events are a justification that as a communication scholar, it is imperative that we continue to examine and analyze local and global discussions of women's rights. As a communication scholar, I turn my attention to rhetoric, specifically how women's rights is discursively created in public address. I'm concerned with the most effective and persuasive way to mobilize communities, governments, and leaders to do more for women's rights. And furthermore, within the field of rhetorical studies, very few speeches by women are used as exemplars for public address, as well as very few examples of the theory and methods about language that women bring into rhetorical studies. So, this paper is both an examination of the arguments and style that women use in crafting messages about women's rights, as well as an attempt to fill in the literature gap that examines public address by women, hopefully contributing to the field of rhetorical studies that often overlooks women's contributions. So I chose 2 speeches as the focus of my analysis. My first speech is Hillary Clinton's speech that she gave in 1995 in Beijing, China, at the 4th World Conference on Women. The second speech that I chose was Emma Watson's speech in 2014. She gave this at the United Nations headquarters in New York, New York. She was launching her He for She campaign. She was there on behalf of that campaign. So I chose these 2 speeches for a few reasons. First of all, almost 20 years apart between the 2 speeches. At the 4th World Conference that Clinton was at 20 years ago, the United Nations set the Millennium Goals. Within those goals, they were there to help countries that were there on behalf of women's rights to help them work towards global levels of gender parity. So since almost 20 years had passed, I wanted to see how their arguments and style compare between Clinton and Watson, who both gave their speeches at the United Nations. I also chose these two speeches because they both received a significant amount of popular press attention about these two female speakers. So the first thing I did was I compared and contrasted the styles that these two women are using. It's important to understand that women enter or are thrust into a world dominated by patriarchal notions of public address. For example, the Neo-Aristotelian method. This method has dominated rhetorical analysis for almost a century. In this method, analysis is concerned primarily with being effective or persuasive. Whether or not a speaker is deemed persuasive or effective is discovered by a thorough analysis of invention, arrangement, style, delivery, and memory. And it's important to understand that this method is noted for having one's own perspectives prevail or dominate, and to accomplish their goals often at the expense or the goals of others. In recent years, rhetorical scholar Carlin Kors Campbell has contributed greatly to the field of women's rhetorical contributions and strategies. And she has theorized the feminine style as an alternative to traditional notions of public address. This method produces discourse that displays a personal tone, uses personal experience, participation, and encourages identification between speaker and audience. It exhibits an inductive structure of logic. So my first analysis was to uncover the style that these two women use to craft their messages as they enter into the contested space of public address. So here's what I found. First of all, for Clinton, it should be recognized that there's a significant body of work, both in the popular press and in academia, that has examined Clinton as an orator. Most of this work points to the assumption that Clinton is primarily known for a more masculine or traditional style of public address, a la the campaign fighter or the courtroom lawyer. However, after analysis, I draw a different conclusion about this speech that she gave at the United Nations. While there are many elements of delivery, style, and argument that can be absolutely concluded are very traditional rhetorical strategies, I argue that Clinton is using a far more feminine style of rhetoric than one might realize, and that this illustrates how effective alternative methods of public address can be. Clinton uses a large amount of personal examples and experiences with global levels of women's rights within the speech. So she specifically talks about all of her experiences traveling around the world, meeting with women, and witnessing firsthand the precarious nature of women's rights around the globe. She uses these examples then to draw an inductive structure of logic that women's rights are essentially human rights. She encourages a strong identification between herself and her audience by explicitly and specifically calling out many global women's rights infractions that her audience is there to attempt to change. And finally, she encourages audience participation. She recognizes her audience's capacity to mobilize, to come together on these issues in the same way that the United Nations has brought about peaceful and effective change on other issues in the past. So, for Watson, what I found for Watson was actually a much more explicit use of the feminine style. She uses almost exclusively personal experiences and examples. So she's drawing on her personal life, having witnessed both men and women in her life growing up and not being able to express themselves in ways that they would prefer for fear that they would not be thought of as masculine or feminine in traditional gender roles. So her argument is largely inductive in structure because of these personal experiences that she's gone through in her life. She is pushing towards more gender equality around the world. Most evident is her call to audience participation. She literally is inviting men to work with women in efforts to achieve more gender equality. She's there on behalf of the He for She campaign, and that campaign is specifically calling for men who may at one point not have felt like they could participate in the movement for women's equality. She is inviting them to the platform to help achieve more gender parity. So in conclusion, women, yes, enter into a male-dominated space of public address, but this doesn't mean that they craft their messages in the same way. They are using the feminine style, and further, this style shouldn't be considered inferior to more traditional methods of public address, and I encourage more rhetorical scholars and textbooks to start putting the feminine style and the ways in which women craft their messages into books that teach young students about public address. So the second half of my analysis moves into a feminist critique of both argument and bodies. So let's first compare the arguments of Clinton and Watson. Clinton's argument is quite simple. It's that women's rights are human rights. And that secondly, if we work towards women's rights, this will create a more peaceful and prosperous world. By comparison, Watson's speech argues a few points. First, she argues for the simplification of the word feminism by drawing upon the denotative meaning of the word. She is also advocating for gender equality, where men and women should be able to express themselves in non-hegemonic ways. Finally, her argument is that men need and should feel welcomed into the fight for equality. While these arguments are strong, we need to examine them cautiously. First, drawing from bell hooks notions of feminist theory, we must be careful to oversimplify the definition of feminism. In doing so, we ignore intersections that impact an individual's ability to achieve equality. Feminism does not exist within a vacuum, and neither Clinton or Watson do enough to recognize the intersections of race, socioeconomic factors, and political factors that impact women's rights. Finally, Watson's speech implies a first world feminism that assumes that we have achieved more global levels of parity than we actually have, global levels that were the subject of Clinton's speech to begin with. Finally, my last critique is that of the use of the white privileged woman to speak on behalf of the global feminist movement and for marginalized populations. Bell hooks reminds us that we need to be critical of the privileged other, speaking on behalf of the other. She argues speaking about the other hides realities of the oppressed people, and that because the most oppressed groups are rarely given the opportunity to speak, they do not associate themselves with the movement because the movement fails to recognize them. So, if we are going to continue to talk about women's rights in public address, we must include a broader range of discourse. In conclusion, I commend Clinton and Watson for their dedication to and their exceptional speeches on women's rights. This critique is in no way trying to undermine the large body of work that both of these women are doing out into the world to create more gender equality. Secondly, the usage of feminine style is being used. It is effective. It is as effective as traditional notions of public address and should be included within rhetorical pedagogy. While these two speeches are exemplars of public address on women's rights, they could be more rhetorically effective. We need to address more explicitly the intersections of feminism with race, sexuality, class, and politics. And furthermore, we need to give agency to marginalized voices so that more women and men identify with and are mobilized to act on the feminist movement. Thank you.